Hello and welcome to this presentation about William Shakespeare and about his works and his relevance today. I am Italian, but I am teaching and living in the United States. In fact, I am recording from my TV studio at my college. I teach at the State University of New York, Suny, Oneonta, and I'm an assistant professor of theater here. My name is Kiara. So today I'm going to talk about a few things that might not necessarily be known in Italy or not as known in Italy. Everybody knows Shakespeare is probably the most important playwright of the Western world, and certainly the most produced one and translated into so many different languages. But there are many anecdotes and many parts of Shakespeare's life and his legacy that are somewhat obscure to us Italians, because we just most of the times appreciate his works in translation and in his adaptations, all of which is performed and produced in Italian. So Shakespeare is to English what probably I would say Dante and Alessandro Manzoni are for the Italian language. Shakespeare contributed to the growth and to the enrichment of the English language in a unique way. According to the Oxford Dictionary and according to the Cambridge Dictionary, so the two main English dictionaries, he contributed with 1,700 new words. I can't even begin to tell you how many of the words that we commonly use in everyday life are actually coming and were invented by Shakespeare and had their first appearance in one of his plays. One of the words that we use commonly, and I use that often as an example, is the word critic. We always talk about theater critics. We always talk about critics, and we don't know that that word was introduced by Shakespeare in Love Labour's Lost, which is one of his comedies. And many words, a lot of negative words such as uncommon, unruly, unjust. Every time you look at un before an adjective, it is quite likely that is coming from Shakespeare. He just created the opposite of a word just by adding to the word a prefix to it. So Shakespeare is the greatest scholar, and a lot of the words that he created also came from Latin, because he attended school in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was had a social status to attend grammar school. Not everybody could go to school. He could, because his father was the mayor of the city of Stratford for a certain amount of time. And so he was exposed to Latin texts. That is very important to know, because you might not know that a lot, if not all, except for one, of Shakespeare's work actually is not original. He adapted it, or he wrote the plots following myth or previous stories or previous texts. And a lot of them, in particular when it comes to comedy, were drawn from Latin comedies, because Latin comedies were what he studied in grammar school. Shakespeare was fluent in Latin. He could speak Latin just as he could speak English. And sometimes he used Latin words and transformed them in English words. And that's how some of the words that you hear in English and that reminds you of Latin, they actually come from Latin, and a lot of them come from Shakespeare's work. Shakespeare was a theater artist, a well-rounded theater artist. He was also a businessman. In fact, he needed to perform, his theater company needed to perform in order to survive. It was pretty much a for-profit business. There were no state fundings, there were no state allocations for theater. So it was either the box office that would provide him the money that comes from the ticket sale that would provide him with a living, or donations from very wealthy and noble families. So in order to maximize his income and the survival of his company, he had two different theaters. One theater is what we probably have seen in many forms and shapes, even in the film Shakespeare in Love, is the Globe Theater on the left side of the River Thames, next to the Tate Modern, the Museum of Contemporary Art in London. And that was his main theater, that his main house, artistic house. What's the idea behind the Globe? Well, first of all, the Globe needed to be outside the city limits because at the time, and we're talking the second half of the 1600s, there was no, theater was not allowed. It was not a legal activity permitted within the city limits. So the best thing was to build a theater right outside the city limits. And the city limits were delineated by the River Thames. So that was the biggest theater he had. And the audience he was looking at was an audience of regular people, of people who wanted to go to the theater, not necessarily to increase their culture, not necessarily to just experience story told by actors, but people who just wanted to have a night out, meet with friends, have a couple of beers, or more than a couple of beers, we are in England after all, and then, in the meantime, see something happening on a stage. The Globe Theatre, as for many Elizabethan theatres, sat next to the pubs. In fact, the pub had direct access to the theater. So basically, the audience, once they paid the ticket, they could go in and out, grab a couple of beers, drink a beer, go back and grab another one, and come back and keep watching the show. And that is one of the reasons why Shakespeare's plays are quite long, because a lot of repetitions were needed to allow the audience to catch up with what was being told, and to make sure that they would not complain because they lost part of the plot. Another element that was added in order to implement this keeping the audience up to speed kind of concept was the ideas of asides. What is an aside? An aside is a moment in a play, in a Shakespeare play, where one of the characters steps out from the scene he's acting in, moves forwards downstage toward the audience, and speaks directly to the audience. We also call that to break the fourth wall, the imaginary wall between the stage and the audience, and addresses the audience directly. That is a way to catch the audience attention, because if I'm speaking directly to you, you better listen to me. And these actors, these moments, these asides, would be the moments where the actors would allow the audience to catch up with what was happening or to understand the motivations of what was going to happen. It was a very unruly audience, so there was no subtlety in the scripts that could fly. They needed to be as clear as possible and, to some extent, as loud as possible. The other theater that Shakespeare owned, on the other hand, or utilized, was a smaller theater. And in that case, the theater was within the city limits. And in order to bypass the laws that forbid theatrical activities to take place inside the city limits, the theater was within a palace. And it was basically a private space. So it was called the Blackfriar Theater. It was basically like a private room, a private space where audience members could be invited. And it's as if somebody was invited to a dinner. Everything that happened within a private property is not affected by city regulations. That was an important element because to that, the audience that would be going to the Blackfriar Theater is, of course, an upper class and nobles. And they would be those Shakespeare would be looking at for donations. That also brought a differentiation in the kind of plays that were performed either at the Globe or at the Blackfriar. The Blackfriar was more for an upper level class audience. So a little bit more of an educated audience. And that's where they would perform most of the tragedies, and in particular the historical plays. That audience would also know better the dynamics of English history. Why was it important? It was important because aside from the business side of the whole operation, Shakespeare needed also a sponsor. Every theater company needed a sponsor to have a patent, to have access to the right to perform. And at the beginning, Shakespeare's had Lord Chamberlain as his sponsor, as the sponsor of his company. In fact, his company was called Lord Chamberlain's Men. Later on in his life, when he truly became a rock star, which we are going to talk about this in a few seconds, he was upgraded, his company was upgraded to the King's Men, because the king very much liked his works. And without a sponsor, they couldn't have done it. Because, as I said, Shakespeare was extremely popular in his time, he was very afraid of other people, other playwrights. There were many other theater companies working in London at the time, stealing his work and taking advantage of his genius. So there were no laws at the time that could, safeguard copyright or protect intellectual property. So in his life, Shakespeare never published his work. And he was extremely careful about how and when and what to do with his scripts. As a matter of fact, there are no surviving original scripts, master copies of Shakespeare's plays. One of the reasons is because the Globe Theatre, where the main office was destroyed by fire several times, but also because Shakespeare destroyed them. He didn't want a full copy of the show to be available. It could be stolen. So what did he do to make sure that he could actually stage his shows? He would provide his actors with scrolls, that is to say, with rolls of paper, and each actor would receive a scroll, and in that scroll, the entire role was written down with the proper cues. So then in rehearsals, clearly, all the actors would gather and rehearse the play, and everybody would know when to say what, because they would kind of combine all the scrolls, but at the same time and in the same space. So even if one scroll got to be lost or stolen, whoever got it could have never gathered the entire script. When Shakespeare died, his popularity was at the peak. And his company decided it was time to publish his works. So they gathered, and it took them a long time to do that, because to put together all the scrolls, the company had been working together for such a long time, they kind of had these stories in their bones. They really didn't need the scrolls that much. But in order to publish them, you have to be sure that everything is accounted for. So of all the plays he wrote, they were able to put together just 18 plays. And the first anthology of Shakespeare's work, the Folio, was published in 1623. So it took them 7 years to put together the first folio. Up until today, the first folio is the most expensive and valuable book you can ever put your hands on. It's worth millions and millions and millions of any kind of currency. The greatest collection of folios is in Washington, D.C. at the Folger Library. One thing that is important to say is that in America and in England, Shakespeare has a legacy and is a source of inspiration for many, many things, and for songs, for musicals. There are adaptations. You're just watching 2 adaptations of Shakespeare's work. one by our own Shakaluga, our own director, and another one is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, a play by Tom Stoppard that focuses on two characters out of Hamlet. Similarly, there are, in particularly in more recent times, there have been authors and there have been scholars who have been working on Shakespeare material and trying to grab his style and adapting his style to other works. And some of them are really fun. One of the authors I like the most is an American playwright, I would say. So he writes plays. And this guy has adapted some of the most famous movies into Shakespeare language. For example, one of his most famous works is Star Wars Shakespeare. And he has adapted all of the episodes of the Star Wars saga, from the original one to the more contemporary ones, and has written them down in iambic pentameter, which is the metric that Shakespeare used for his verse plays. And then he wrote this one, which is clearly based off Back to the Future, the film, the very famous films of the late 80s. Get thee back to the future. Get thee, thee is the ancient, the old English form of you. You go back to the future. And another one that is very famous, and is, of course, making a pun out of Shakespeare title, is Much Ado About Mean Girls. Mean Girls being a very popular movies, more recent movies of the 200 and some, 2000 and some. And it's very popular in the United States. They have just adapted it for Broadway. There was a musical that was very successful on Broadway up until the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, because we're talking about a time where political satire is a very active way of being politically active, we also have adaptations of politics into Shakespeare language. And this is the same author, Ian Dosher, who wrote Mac Trump. And this is actually one of the first books he wrote about Trump and the Trump administration. There are several others. Mac Trump is clearly based off Macbeth, the tragedy of Macbeth. And it's funny, and it's extremely well written, of course, because all of his books also have very nice graphics, and with all the people that are involved in the story that are Shakespeareized in a way or another. One of the things that I like the most that William did, out of what William did, is the graphic novels and manga Shakespeare. So this is one example of Othello, and it's a manga Shakespeare, which is a graphic novel. What I like about those is that, as you can see, they're pretty much graphic novels. They're pretty much they're very visual. And of course, Othello is a 3.5 hour long play. This is much shorter. What I like about these is they actually give you a very immediate and visualized version of the play. And while they still keep the language, they do a very good job at creating a timeline for the audience to read. Another element that I really like, Shakespeare didn't just write plays. He was a poet as well, and he wrote sonnets. And his style in sonnets was very specific. He used verse and a certain kind of metric in his sonnets that has become iconic. And there are authors who have been trying, or who did actually rewrite Shakespeare's sonnets, but they used different material, source material. This is one of my favorite ones. And in this case, Erik Didriksen rewrote some of the most famous songs, such as you see on the right, My Heart Will Go On, Celine Dion's hit coming from the movie Titanic, with a sonnet format. Or, for those of you who like The Cure, Friday I'm in Love is one of the most famous songs by Cure, adapted into a sonnet, a Shakespeare sonnet version. One of the things that normally isn't known about Shakespeare is that we tend to consider him like one of the greatest scholars of all time, one of the greatest playwrights of all time. Just everything of that is true. But he also used to write very earthly and grounded things. Most of his plays include an outstanding amount of sexual innuendos, or actually not just innuendos, plain out sexual talk, and foul words, and cussing and cursing and all of that. And Shakespeare is actually considered to be one of the most ingenious writers of curses. Why we're not really familiar about that? Well, first of all, because Shakespeare is wildly studied in high schools and middle schools, scuole medie e scuole superiori in Italian. And because of this idea of not exposing young people to certain arguments, and because Shakespeare's material is today in the public domain, most of these references tend to be cut. So I have many students coming to me in college, and they all believe that, Shakespeare is this most elegant writer and a godly character. He is one of the best writers in the world has ever seen, but that doesn't mean that he didn't write bawdy or kinky material. He did. It just was edited. So when you finally get to use the original scripts, and in order to use the original scripts, you have to go back to the original anthology, to the folio, which is still available online. You can download it. You can download each play from the Shakespeare archive in its original form. And of course, as for everything, there are several editions of Shakespeare. Some of them are edited for the use of young minds, and some of them are not edited for the use of normal people. And this is basically it. You will see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. You have seen, you will see the adaptation of Hamlet by Shakaluga. And those are two adaptations of Hamlet. Hamlet was of course one of his most famous plays, and was written in 1599 or in 1601. It's unclear. And it was one of his plays that has been most adapted and developed historically. If you look at film adaptations of Shakespeare, of Hamlet, you will just find literally hundreds. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead originally was written in 1966 by Tom Stoppard, a British playwright who's still alive, and it premiered at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, the most important theatrical festival in the UK. And then it was so successful that in 1967, that is to say the following year, the National Theatre produced it in its premises. The film version of it happened way later. It happened in the 90s, in 1991, I think. And Tom Stoppard did also write the screenplay for it. And it became one of the most iconic movies of all time. I really recommend you watch it. Gary Oldman playing Rosencrantz and Tim Roth playing Guildenstern do an amazing work. And of course, the aesthetic of the play itself became the aesthetic of Stoppard in many ways, where his language really adapted well to the contemporary setting and used a misplacement of meaning to alienate and to vehicle philosophical concepts. Tom Stoppard is also famous because he co-wrote with Mark Norman Shakespeare in Love. That is a very accurate movie about Shakespeare and about his life and his theater. And And Tom Stoppard won the Academy Award, the Oscar, for the screenplay for that play, as it was considered best film. So I'm hoping you will learn a little bit more about Shakespeare and learn that he's not just a boring guy. He did lots of amazing things. And maybe you can read one of those books. I'm not sure if they're translated into Italian, but it's a nice way also to introduce yourself to Shakespeare's language, because it is different from English, from modern English. And this is a struggle that we have in the US or in England when we produce Shakespeare in the original language, because for us, here, Shakespeare is done in its original language. That doesn't mean it's easy to understand from students or from actors, because the English language has evolved. So studying the language is part of the process of putting together a Shakespeare production, which is not necessarily what happens when you produce and you perform Shakespeare in translation. And I'm leaving you now with a Facebook page. Of course, it's a fictional Facebook page. It was the work of an artist a few years ago. And it showcases Hamlet's history, Hamlet's life, and Hamlet's arc in the play through Facebook. Of course, this is fictional, and I just think it is worth a good laugh. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.